Hello, welcome to the channel. I am the collaborative negotiator, professional negotiator with over 10 years of experience, and I like to use this channel to talk about negotiation concepts. And one of the favourite concepts for any negotiator to talk about are the balance of power dynamics. And we like talking about that, apart from the fact that it is interesting, but also because it shapes the way a lot of people think, the way they can be influenced, and the way that people can have strengths and weaknesses when it comes to putting together negotiation positions. And of course, when you want to talk about balance of power dynamics, then obviously the most interesting area to look at is international relations and geopolitics. And of course, right now we are in a period of significant historical change, with Russia having invaded Ukraine following a massive worldwide pandemic. The world is never going to be the same after all of these events. So the question, of course, that will be, on various people's minds is what will happen? What will be the changes that will come out of this? So in this video, I'm going to put forward a very different and speculative idea. This is something I've not heard talked about much yet, but I'm sure at some point there will be various people, such as academics, who will be floating these ideas. And I have to stress, this is very much my speculation. I'm not drawn upon any other sources, and of course I could be completely and utterly wrong. So, I want to talk about European power dynamics. And of course, we have to start at the current events, which is that Putin has invaded Ukraine. And what has he done? Well, quite apart from, obviously, all the military consequences and the sanctions and so on, and the impact upon Russia of what he has done, it has been widely commented that Putin had managed to do something that no other European leader managed to do, which is to unify Europe in a way that has never been seen before. And if I was the Chinese, I would be very angry at Putin right now, because they've taken decades following their strategic plan, trying to make themselves powerful, set themselves up as the next dominant power. But of course they can only do that based on certain things. A stable world order being one of them, but the ability to exert their influence on other nations and power blocks, to use power, particularly economic power, to be able to leverage their interests. And of course, to do that, there's an element of, divide and rule. So of course, the Chinese strategy has very much been to divide and rule Europe from America, for example, the various European states within Europe. So what has happened is China has now found itself on the wrong side of the fence at precisely the wrong time, because Russia had just screwed everything up. So what this means is that Europe has now banded together against all enemies external. Obviously, the primary one right now is Russia. But anyone else who is seen as supportive of Russia is going to be seen as somebody that cannot be trusted. That is no friend of Europe. And this puts countries like China in a very difficult spot. But it does something else as well. It makes the Europe more cohesive. And I have to stress that point, because Europe has not at all been very cohesive. They may have banded together, they may do lots of things together, but in many ways they have not been cohesive. And for the first time, they actually seem to be quite cohesive as a bloc. And before, you could never say that about Europe. You could never say they were a bloc. You could just say it was 27 or 28, as it was when the UK was part of it. Those countries that shared common interests but diverged as often as they came together. So right now, we're looking at convergence on a scale that we have never seen before. So what the invasion of Ukraine has also done, it made Europe more relevant, particularly the EU and NATO. Because the benefits are obvious. To stand up to an aggressor, you need to have friends. You need to be part of a bloc, people that will defend you militarily and economically. In today's world, especially when you're going up against nuclear power, economic power is just as important as military power. And we can see that in what is going on at the moment. And when it comes to leveraging economic power and really turning the screws on a country, then you're not really going to beat the US or the EU, let alone the two of them working together. Now, admittedly, if you're in the Middle East and part of the power blocks there, you have your leverage of oil, for example. OPEC, in particular, demonstrated this in the 70s. But that's quite a limited power. That is nowhere near as broad or extensive as the sanctions that the EU and the US have just hammered Russia with. That's a real demonstration of economic might, the ability to control international institutions, the flow of money. And that power has never been used in that way before, to that extent. And suddenly Europe has discovered that when they agree on something and they agree to use that power together, they've got an awful lot of force, that economic force, that can be applied. So they're applying that in Russia now. But who will they apply that in the future, maybe? Putin's also done something else, and he has forced Europe to confront its weaknesses. Now, this is not exclusively a Putin thing. There are many other facets to this, and many of them well known. But nothing focuses minds quite like when you're in an emergency. So by creating that emergency scenario, Putin has created an environment in which people are willing more than ever to band together, to put their differences aside and actually work together to fix those weaknesses. And that is the position Europe is in right now, particularly the EU. Prior to the invasion, the EU was looking a little bit aimless, a little bit, people weren't sure the project, people weren't sure how successful it was going to be. It faced some seminal choices, shall we say. Now that is clearer, much clearer. But, and I should stress, the story doesn't start with Ukraine. The story goes back quite a few years. But what Ukraine represents is a trigger point, a focal point. And this is when we can speculate, but we can imagine that things are really going to shift within Europe. Let me talk you through that. First, I want to focus a little bit on some of the weaknesses of Europe. To understand some of the things that have stopped the EU from being this massive power bloc, we have to understand its weaknesses. So I'll start with the financial weakness, in a way, which is one thing that's strongly linked with the EU is, of course, the euro, the currency. Now, the euro has always been seen as a political project more than an economic project. That was very clear from the beginning, and there's plenty of economic literature to support that. And that hasn't, by and large, that has not changed. So if we go back to around about 2015, we can remember the Greece debt crisis. And that really exposed some fundamental weaknesses of the euro and the EU banking system as a whole. It exposed the interdependencies. It exposed the fact that the euro is not a tool, not a currency that can be adjusted to suit individual nations. And I should highlight, by the way, that these are very similar arguments for the US dollar. Powerful as the US dollar is, it is an equal handicap to the various 50 nations that form the United States. If the state of Texas requires a weak dollar for economic reasons, but the state of California requires a strong dollar for different economic reasons, then neither of their demands can really be met. And the euro is exactly the same. And this is what the Greek debt crisis exposed in several ways. But it also exposed that European banking was not set up in a way to deal with crisis, to deal with issues. And all of this that stemmed from the 2008 sort of financial crisis. Now Europe has learnt from that. They have set up emergency monetary funds. They have completely reformed how European banking works and some of the things that European Central Bank will do. Things that it could not be allowed to do during the Greek crisis, it now can do. It has more tools, has more options. Greece is still paying the price, by the way. So Greece is no state, not out of the woods. They've got some serious debt problems, and they represent still a significant weakness to the European financial system. But that financial system is now far more robust than it was in 2015. So other shocks like Greece, and similarly what nearly happened in Spain and Portugal and Italy, should not threaten the stability of the euro as they could have done back then. So this is one of the important things to remember, because for any nation or bloc of nations even that wants to be powerful and to exert influence around the world, a strong currency is absolutely fundamental to that goal. And with the US dollar now not being seen, perhaps in certain quarters, as the reserve or fiat currency that certain countries may wish to use, they may wish to consider the euro as an alternative. Or maybe even they'll go to the Chinese yuan. Less questions asked, perhaps, less stringent. But this is the thing, the Chinese had the goal of making their currency more powerful. Putin had just wrecked that. So that means the euro is now the next currency after the dollar. And that is a very powerful tool. The next thing I want to talk about is the failure to secure unity on the issue of immigration. And this was a big thing in Europe. For those who remember the floods of refugees from Syria and Afghanistan and so on, the EU as a bloc did not deal very well or effectively with the challenges of immigration. Countries like Greece and Italy had to bear the brunt of the immigration without sufficient support from Northern Europe, or Central and Northern Europe I should say. Look at where we are now. Complete change. The unity for supporting Ukrainian refugees had completely swept those old issues aside. Suddenly, Europe wants to be welcoming to refugees in a way it has never been before. And all the nations are agreed on that. You could never get them to agree on anything when it came to refugees, yet suddenly here they are all agreeing on the need to support Ukrainian refugees. That is a huge shift, and that is a shift that can carry on going forward. And this is important, and I'll come on to that when I talk about the movement of labour within the EU. The next thing I want to focus on is the lack of strategic objectives, especially when it came to things like foreign and defence policies. The EU doesn't really have foreign or defence policies. It does have trade policies, however, which is a bit of an extension of foreign policies in some ways. But the EU doesn't have diplomats. It doesn't have soldiers and army. It doesn't even have particularly coherent, defence infrastructure, to be honest. That's just either linked to NATO or held by individual nation states. Now that Russia has threatened Ukraine, suddenly the need for everybody to speak with one voice, let's call them European diplomats representing all 27 nations, the need for self-defence, the ability to have aligned defence programmes. This is going to change how, and already has changed, how Europe thinks about issues that previously member states did not want to delegate to the European Union. Now suddenly they're seeing that there's an urgent need to do so. And this again is important for any nation or federation, perhaps shall we say, that wants to become powerful. You have to have foreign policies and defence policies in order to cement your power. And of course the final thing to talk about, that there's a general point in that the European Union was very slow and creaky to reach decisions. Now when it comes to agreeing things like common standards, slow as that process can be, the EU has been hugely effective here. And this is because one of the strengths of what European politicians can do is they can build consensus. That is what the political system obliges them to do. And the European Union is very much an extension of that. And one of the easiest ways that the EU finds to build consensus is on the issues of regulations and standards, because everyone can recognise the benefits of unified regulatory standards. Everybody, of course, except Brexiteers, who seem to have completely and utterly failed to realise how important this is, and the cost of trying to diverge from a powerful bloc that hasn't. But this is what you have to remember, that the EU, it creates those standards for the benefit of EU members. But all the work, all the bureaucracy, all the effort that goes into creating a common standard is very time and resource consuming. And the EU is seen as a world leader around the world in doing this. This is why the rest of the world, apart from perhaps the US and various nations for domestic reasons, but the rest of the world copies EU standards. They do so because they recognise how beneficial it is to have unified standards. So fine as that was for the EU when it came to decision making, on anything else it couldn't really get that unity. It couldn't get the member states to agree common positions, for Parliament to all vote the same way, and so on and so forth. That has always been one of the challenges for the EU. This is why the EU has never been a body that can be seen to make decisions quickly. However, in recent time, we've seen a few changes to that, and I'll talk a bit more about that. But there's a few other seminal events that I would like to draw attention to. Let's start, of course, with a very obvious recent one, the pandemic. Now, initially, the EU pandemic's response was not that great, and I criticised what they did and pointed out the mistakes of how they approached some of the issues, particularly around vaccine. However, as is always the case, they learnt from their mistakes. And also the other states learnt a lesson. They learnt of one of the benefits of being part of a bloc that can tap into individual industrial strengths to form an overall excellent package. So remember that when the EU was delivering vaccine or creating vaccines, they're being grown in the Netherlands, put together in Belgium, the vials have been shipped in from Italy, whatever. I'm sure I've missed out quite a few countries. But that is one of the advantages of being part of a trading bloc, is that you have immediate access to whatever the centres of excellence are. And that is what people realised a little bit from vaccines, is that done right, the EU has that ability. The only other sort of nation to have that ability are nations like the US, because the US is so large and with such a wide ranging of industrial and technical specialisms, in 50 states, that gives the US a similar advantage. But also what the EU did realise with vaccine, and with the lessons of vaccine nationalism, with the importance of being able to marshal your industrialisation and use it almost like an extension of foreign policy. Now, of course, we all know some of the stories of what happened with vaccines and some of the not so great results, particularly for those in Africa, who very much have been at the tail end of the queue to receive those vaccines. But that's what is highlighted to the EU and to the members of the EU, that was their potential to really shine. They could really put together huge industrial might and use that to create goodwill in places like Africa and various nations by sending them vaccines at a scale that no one else could match. That is a very much, people call that sort of thing soft power in diplomatic terms. And I think this is one of the lessons that they perhaps learned from the pandemic, is that if they do it right, they have the ability to apply an awful lot of industrial specialisms and might, and then to use that to also further policy objectives outside of the EU. And that is again something any superpower is able to do. Britain was able to do that in the time of the British Empire. The US is able to do that today. China is striving for that goal and has some limited degrees of success, but has not yet reached that point. And the EU perhaps are realising that they also can compete in that space. Now I want to talk about another significant issue, which is supply chain shortages. Because we all know that as a result of COVID, the pandemic, we ended up with lots of supply chain bottlenecks. What that and the pandemic really exposed to the world was some of the perils of having globalized supply chains, particularly supply lines that run all the way to China, because they can be cut off. They can be cut off by China. They can be cut off by a ship blocking the Suez Canal. They can be cut off by economic factors, excessive costs, whether that be the cost of oil, for example, or the cost of shipping freight. So what this meant is that the European nations have realised how important it is not to outsource everything abroad, basically. And what you have to remember is no nation can do everything, and even the US can't do it, despite their best efforts in certain cases. No one nation can supply everything it needs in any specific industry. But again, this is one of the massive advantages for the EU. They are not one industry or one nation. They are 27 plus other partners. 27 nations with 27 different strengths and weaknesses. So when it comes to building a strong supply chain, well, they don't get much stronger than operating within a single market, within a single trading bloc. You can if you've got a shortages in one country, you can very easily pick up the phone to a company in another country within the EU and ask them if they can meet that shortage in a hurry. And if they have the capacity, they will. And they even take the same currency, perhaps. The euro makes the whole process so much easier. The ability to adjust and to have agile supply chains has been exposed as much easier within Europe than outside of Europe. And this, again, is a fundamental strength for anyone that perhaps wants to be a superpower or a superbloc. We also must remember the value of movement of labour. And this has been so cruelly exposed by Brexit. Brexit and Brexiteers pursued an anti-immigration policy. And they succeeded, in a way. But what this really did was taught everyone else what happens when you do that, which is suddenly you have shortages, labour shortages, because you cannot get the people. And you need a wide range of people. And again, exactly as I was talking about for the supply chain resilience, Europe is in a unique position that people can just flow across borders in numbers easily and go where the work is, go where the shortage is. So that is a great leveller for all the members of the EU. Any problem that they want to fix, and they need a massive number of people, they don't just have to draw upon their own national population. They can draw upon all the other population in all the 27 member states. They can even encourage more immigration to suit particular needs, and countries will do that. So this has really demonstrated, Brexit demonstrated how short-sighted it is to pursue a policy of limiting labour movement. And this has been a cornerstone of economic theory for a long time. One of the ways to make an economy better and more efficient was to enable more labour movement. And yet the UK had gone completely the opposite path, and we have seen the economic consequences of the UK pursuing that sort of policy. You see similar sort of scenarios in countries like Australia, when they have labour limiting issues because they have very strict immigration controls. The EU, in contrast, has shown far more agility and ability to surge people where they're required because of the completely different philosophy that underpin the freedom of movement and the freedom of money and capital that exists within the single market. And then there's the final point I want to make here, which is the value of strategic partnerships. And I'll draw upon one example. There are many, many others, but I'll just draw upon one, which is the EU had formed partnerships with, for example, North Africa, countries like Tunisia and Morocco, particularly Morocco, I think. And they've done so deliberately because you always want to have friendly neighbours, shall we say. But they've also done so in the pursuit of self-interest. What does Morocco have that the EU might be very interested in? Well, lots of sunshine. Great place to build solar panels, for example. So this is why the EU has deliberately pursued a policy of building strategic partnerships with such nations in order that you could create more energy security, for example, more trade, more economic interdependence. And they pursued very similar goals with other nations in the other side of the Mediterranean for very much similar reasons. And this again, it doesn't hurt to have friends when it comes to dealing with international issues and challenges. And very few people have more friends than the EU when you really look into it. This again is another influencer, another thing that's important for any nation or block of nations that want to reach superpower status. This is one thing people keep forgetting. You can never be powerful if everybody really hates you, because then they won't cooperate with you. They won't cooperate with you. How are you going to achieve your ends? So what do we have next for Europe? Well, there's certain thing that they will need to do and to focus on. So they will need to optimize, first, they will need to increase membership. That very much already is on the cards. Lots of countries have seen what Russia has done to Ukraine, and their answer is more membership. That gives the EU more power, more sway. It also gives them perhaps some more strategic advantages, and I'll name just one, which is that if Ukraine does join the EU, as has been very well publicised recently, a very large chunk of the world's grain of wheat comes from Ukraine. So if Ukraine becomes an EU member, that wheat, that agricultural power, is now within the borders of the EU bloc. And I'm not going to say that they will use or misuse such a power, but it will be there. It is another way that you can influence people outside as part of foreign policy by having those kind of industrial stroke agricultural advantages. And the EU and member states have recognised this. This is why the EU has set up so many funds for promoting European technologies, European industrial bases. Those funds come with conditions, and those conditions are very much that they have to be spent within the EU bloc to the advantage of EU member states. That is deliberate, that is not accidental, and that is all part of the wider strategic goal of increasing their membership, influencing their power, and then increasing their competitive advantage in a wide range of sectors. Now I've picked on technological and industrial, but it's also financial. And when the UK left the EU, there was a sudden realisation that they needed to have stronger financial markets within the EU bloc, which ironically enough will shut out London, and perhaps there's a political revenge in that policy. But there was more practical drivers as well. The ability for Europe to influence where the flows of money and capital and resources goes to European advantage in the industrial, agricultural, technical sectors. That is important. All economics will talk about the flow of money being important for growth. We've also seen a resurgence of the question, should there be a European army? And that really would be a huge shift. That really would demonstrate the European Union becoming a bloc, like the United States, and for very similar advantages. That's what they cite. You get economies of scale advantages. You get unified structures. You don't have duplication of policies. I think the EU is a long way away from the European army, but what they're not a long way away from is having more coherent defence policies. Many, many years ago, the European Union published studies criticising the fact that of the 28 or so member states, there were at least 15 different tank production facilities within the European bloc. They want things like that to be smaller. They want to leverage whoever is the best at any particular technology to do the more production. And if you do that consistently and more frequently, then you end up gaining more advantages as a result. So, as a recognition of what Putin has done, European member states will be looking to see who is at the best in certain areas. So, for example, the Germans may have the best tanks. The Dutch may have the best electronics. The French may have the best helicopter. Whatever it may be, I'm making those up by the way, but whatever those advantages may be, they will work together to secure those advantages for a pan-European defence policy. And that can be quite powerful. That's a lot of money they can spend. That can give them a lot of advantages militarily as well as economically. And there's also going to be further international dominance. I've talked about standards, the way the EU can dominate the world by setting standards that people can try and rail and not want to comply with those standards, but they end up having to do so anyway because those standards become de facto the world standards. So this is one of the things, an extension of what the EU can do. When it comes to the expansion into foreign or defence policies, they can set the benchmark and force other people to follow. But that's one of the advantages, again, of the EU as well as the disadvantage. They need to build consensus. But because they do build consensus, it makes it harder to resist. You are one nation going up against a consensus of 27 nations. It doesn't matter how big or powerful as a nation you are, if you've got 27 nations agreeing against you, that is a force all in itself. And that is a very powerful ability to influence internationally. So what do we have? We have the scope for the EU to become a superpower, perhaps, as a result of all these challenges that they've been forced to meet. This is the Brexit nightmare. You see, Brexit promoted the fact that EU was on a downwards trajectory, that it had split apart, become irrelevant, they have become fractured, weaker. And yet, here I am speculating that the complete opposite is happening. As a result of the pandemic, as a result of supply chain shortages, and as a result of Putin, the EU is now not going to break apart. They're not going to drift away and be mired in arguments and indecision. They're going to come together in a way that we saw that they've done on Ukraine. And if they do that on more issues, not just Ukraine, then they become more assertive as a superbloc. They have more members because people are clamouring to join the EU. There's the irony. The UK leaves just as more people want to join the EU, and as the EU becomes more powerful. And in some ways, this really is a nightmare for the UK. just as the EU reaches a point when it can really leverage its power for the benefit of its members, the UK splits off and is now a small island between one superbloc and one superpower, that's the US, on the other side, able to exert significant influence on neither, being perhaps the poor cousin to both. So what does this mean? Well, we mean we're in for a very change in time. We can see the EU able to project influence, and perhaps even more so than ever before, to defend its interests, to make an impact, to even counter other people, whether through economic, not just unlikely to be militarily, to be honest, but through economic might. The EU is going to be able to rival the US in quite a lot of areas. So, of course, this is all based upon the assumption that the EU can continue to act in a unified way, can continue to make decisions quickly. And in the past, that definitely was not the EU's strength. Yet suddenly, more recently, we have seen that become an EU strength, that the EU has suddenly been able to do things extraordinarily quickly, faster than anyone's ever seen them do it before, whether that's on sanctions, whether that's ramping up military expenditure, supplying support to Ukraine, supporting Ukrainian refugees. They've even outmaneuvered or been faster than the US, and the US has got a very divisive executive by international standards in some ways. So that has been a real shift, a real change in behaviour that we haven't seen before. And if that continues, then that will expand into a wider range of areas. And if that expands on everything that the EU does, then lo and behold, you've got a massive federation with a lot of power, the ability to move quickly, the ability to leverage that power, and the ability to be the next superpower. So I hope you found that speculative video interesting. If you do like this sort of thing, please do like and subscribe. And of course, I shall look forward to seeing the comments in the comments box below.